I was born into the binary. You see, I'm a twin, a boy-girl pair, and as any twin will tell you, you have both an individual identity and a dual identity, often known as the twins. I'm also biracial, bicultural, and I grew up with both Christian and Muslim influences, and I moved between my divorced parents' houses every week. So I got very good at conforming to fit into two very different worlds. And by the time I was a teenager, I was living a pretty epic double life. I was a straight-A student and a devout Jehovah's Witness at the same time as I was regularly sniffing spray paint and hanging out in gangs. Don't tell my parents. They're there. In my conservative Christian religion, gender was very binary. Men and women had distinct and rigid roles. As a woman, I was never going to be an elder or leader in the church. I was discouraged from seeking higher education because it would just detract me from serving God. My dress was prescribed to cover my body modestly. My sexuality was controlled. And when I did marry, my husband would be my boss. I certainly wasn't going to be a feminist activist. I tried desperately to squash myself to fit into that patriarchal box. But the creative, ambitious, and expansive parts of myself rebelled in the only way that they knew how, through self-destruction. At 17, I decided I was going to try and escape this double life that I'd created and go to Japan to study for a year. But as they say, wherever you go, there you are. So perhaps you won't be surprised to hear that I just created another double life for myself in Japan. The epitome of which was perhaps when I got baptized in front of thousands of people, dedicating my life to God, washing away my sins, only to lose my virginity in a Tokyo Love hotel the very next week. I could not for the life of me stay inside that box. Anyway, I was constantly filled with shame and confusion, and I was desperately seeking a sense of belonging. And believe me, I searched everywhere. I searched in sex and drugs and religion and love. I even trekked the Himalayas and searched for it at the top of a mountain. I traveled alone across India, searching in the great histories of spirituality. I sat in temples in Thailand, but all to no avail. But I'm a problem solver and a researcher at heart, and I was determined to get to the bottom of what I craved. So I spent the next 20 years studying how the world defines us as people, how it shapes our identities and dictates our behaviours. I certainly rebelled against the idea that a woman wasn't supposed to get an education, and by the time I was 30, I had multiple degrees and a PhD in gender studies. I went on to conduct dozens of studies around the world, work for the United Nations, and lead one of the world's largest research projects with over 13,000 men and women across 7 countries to understand gender norms and how to prevent violence against women. And from all that research and study and seeking, this is what I have learned. Rigid gender norms are killing us. And I believe it is going to be feminism that saved us all. What do I mean by that? Well, according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, nearly 50,000 women and girls are killed by a member of their own family every year. That's someone every 11 minutes. So by the time I finish this talk, another woman or girl will be dead from this preventable violence. And to make matters worse, UN Women reports that since COVID-19, all forms of violence against women, but particularly domestic violence, have only intensified. In societies where there is rigid adherence to gender stereotypes, such as the idea that as a man you need to be tough or dominant, that women need to be the primary carers, we see higher rates of that violence. In the study that I led, the UN multi-country study on men and violence, we found that the single most common factor that explained men's use of violence was related to harmful gender norms and dominant notions of masculinity. And these rigid norms, they don't just harm women and girls. You know, one of my favorite feminist scholars is Bell Hooks, and she explained that the first act of violence that the patriarchy demands of men is not violence against women. The patriarchy demands that men kill off the emotional parts of themselves. And it's in part because of that in Australia, suicide is the leading cause of death for men aged 15 to 24. The Australian longitudinal study on men's health shows that conforming to masculine norms, such as the idea that men should be the provider or the protector and not show emotion, that increases the risk of suicide and makes men less likely to seek help. And this isn't just a problem in Australia. According to the WHO Global Early Adolescence Study, whether a child is in Baltimore or Beijing or New Delhi, adolescence triggers a common set of gender expectations that lead to increased mental and physical health problems. For girls, that includes early marriage, early pregnancy, leaving school early, exposure to violence and sexually transmitted infections. For boys, it increases risk of suicide, substance abuse, and a shorter life expectancy than women. And this also harms people with gender diverse identities who face discrimination, stigma, and abuse because of the very fact that they challenge this binary. We are so attached to these ideas of defining ourselves, but they are literally going to be the death of us. The good news is we're not born this way. Despite our desperate attempts to define children even before birth, I'm looking at you, gender reveal parties, we are not born gendered. We learn this through socialization at an early age, in school with caregivers, through the media, through the books we read, the toys that we play with. And you know, in many Indigenous and traditional cultures, gender was never defined as binary. Western Christian doctrine has imposed that on much of the world through colonization, just like it imposed it upon me as a teenager. But if we learn it, we can unlearn it. And I'm happy to say we are finally starting to see a rejection of these systems that don't serve us. The gender binary is rightly being called into question. And since COVID, we've seen millions of people resign from their jobs, in part questioning the very meanings of our lives. I believe that this reflects a reckoning with authenticity and integrity at both an individual and an institutional level. And I don't mean the you be you version of authenticity that we see on social media. I'm talking about the very definition of integrity, the state of being whole and undivided, to be integrated. I believe that's what we seek as human beings, and I think an intersectional feminist revolution can help us get there. Now, I know feminism's had a bit of a bad rap, but I think it's time we got clear that feminism is not about pitting women against men. The patriarchal system splits us into binaries and defines men as dominant over women, children, and nature. Feminism is a movement to liberate all of us from these destructive systems. Feminism is freedom, the freedom to live without constraint, to unpack these boxes that we've put ourselves in, to challenge that. It's not just in service of women. Feminism is in service of humanity and the planet, and it gives us a framework for creating change. So I want to share 3 things that I think that we can all take from a feminist framework. First, let's talk about you as individuals. Feminist revolutions are first and foremost an internal one. We see an individual as a site of change, and that change starts with you. So I want to ask you, what did you learn about what it means to be human? What did you learn about gender growing up? How has that shaped what you think is possible for yourselves, for your families? What norms don't serve you anymore, and maybe you can unlearn to become more fully yourself? In the answers to those questions is maybe the beginning of your own feminist revolution. Next, let's talk about workplaces. Feminism reminds us that the personal is political, and you can't neatly divide your personal and professional life. In the past, you might have heard, don't bring your personal life to work. But that really doesn't make that much sense when your workplace is now your bedroom. Everyone can literally see your dirty laundry and your partner or your dog or your children demanding your attention in the background of a Zoom meeting. But seriously, I think one of the reasons we've seen such high resignation rates since COVID, particularly among women, is because organisations presented this airbrushed image to the world. But the reality faced by employees inside those organisations was toxic. There was a disconnect, a lack of integrity, if you will. But the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and high-profile cases of sexual harassment have shattered that facade. And people are saying enough is enough. Feminism, a feminist framework, helps workplaces create true cultures of safety, inclusion, and belonging. A feminist workplace centres the voices of those who have been silenced. It teaches us that leadership can be based on empathy and respect, not dominance and control. It allows space for continual learning. It's not afraid of failure. It acknowledges that vulnerability is a strength, and it creates space for employees to show up as their full human selves. Sounds like a pretty good place to work, right? Now, let's finally talk about society as a whole. As the brilliant Black feminist Audre Lorde says, I am not free until every woman is free, even when her shackles look very different from my own. So that means I must be as equally invested in your liberation as I am mine. An intersectional feminist revolution shows us that we do not all have the same lived experience, and we must tackle all forms of inequality, be that gender inequality, racial injustice, transphobia, or ableism, together. Now is the time to take action wherever you hold power and influence, whether that's in your home, your workplace, your school, your community. Reflect on your own privilege, create space for those who have had less power, advocate for more women in leadership and more men to take up parental leave, call out everyday sexism, diversify the books you read, talk to children about gender issues and let them show up as the full human selves. Encourage boys to show emotion, encourage girls to explore pleasure. There are thousands of things that we can do every single day to create change. Look, to be honest, I don't care if you call yourself a feminist or not. It's just a word. I don't want to get caught up in labels, but the ideas that it represents, the idea that we are interconnected, the idea that we should share power, that we should not be constrained by these ideas of what it means to be male or female, that we are all equally deserving of respect, opportunities, and freedom, and that we all have a responsibility to dismantle these systems that are literally killing us. Well, I think that's an idea worth spreading. It turns out I was not born into the binary. I learned that, and I have unlearned it. Feminism saved me by bringing me back to the truth that I was born perfect and whole. Maybe it can save you too.